Good evening, folks, and welcome back, everybody. I'm TS, and this is the simulcast up and running now for January the 20th, 1995. Barbara Walters is on this program tonight from ABC News, and an Oscar Award, or excuse me, a Golden Globe Award nominee for her work in the motion picture Tom and Viv. We have the actress Miranda Richardson on tonight's program, and of course, all of you on the toll-free highway at the 800 number. George Burns, bless him, is 99 years old today. And I read in the paper that he has not given up smoking cigars, but he is down from about a dozen cigars a day now to 3. And George plays cards and sometimes golf at a club here in Los Angeles, at which 5 years ago they banned smoking in the clubhouse. And he wrote a lovely letter to the board of directors, I'm told, which said, I've been smoking cigars since I'm 12 years old. I like to have a dozen a day. I can cut that down, but I need to be able to smoke in the clubhouse. At the next board of directors meeting, and you know private clubs are often very, very difficult to advance into modern times, but they held a long meeting and they finally changed the rule. At Mr. Burns' club, there is no smoking by anybody who is under the age of 97. I love that story. I've got a lot of Barbara Walters stories, but my favorite is the time that she and I first worked together in New York City in 1974. And you will find this hard to believe in this age of 7-second sound bites on the evening news. But she and I did a 3-hour primetime news documentary that went on from 8 to 11 o'clock and took the entire prime time on one evening on NBC television. And it was the story of men and women and the changing roles between the sexes back in the 1970s. And I had just come to New York from California. And if you knew me then, there was all this stuff that I was brash and that I was arrogant and that I was a big mouth and all that stuff. And a part of it was true, maybe 10%, but not all. And of course, Barbara Walters had been pictured as the hard-driving, demanding, dogmatic co-anchor of the Today Show with the late Frank McGee. And so we were seen within NBC as two people of enormous egos, and that once we got on the television stage together over in Brooklyn to make this documentary, we would have arguments, and we would literally kill each other in front of the cameras. Now, the management of television, you know, the presidents, the vice presidents, you know, the suits, as you've heard them called, they love it when the stars fight. Like, I mean, they have a field day with Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer, you know, and they have a field day with Roseanne Barr and her producers. They love to see a fight. They love to see us go nuts and self-destruct because they believe we're all children, and they hate the millions of dollars they have to pay us to do these programs. That's basically what it is. And by the way, for the most part, they all wanted to do the 11 o'clock news, and they couldn't read. So, that's the truth now. You can laugh, but it's true. So we were over in Brooklyn at the NBC studios there back in '74 on a very cold December afternoon, and half the management of NBC was back at 30 Rock in Manhattan watching the studio to see Snyder and Walters absolutely kill each other. We got there, we shook hands, we spent 2 wonderful days going to lunch at a wonderful Italian restaurant called Bonaparte's there in Brooklyn. Got the show done, it was a big hit, everybody loved it, there was absolutely no fight and no argument, but tonight I'm going to tear her heart out now. And they said, geez, we can't believe that you two got along so well. Well, why wouldn't we? You know, we're adult people who enjoy doing television and enjoy doing broadcast, and it was all just fine. And I can't wait to get her out here in just a couple of seconds. But I have to tell you the last thing I talked about with Jocelyn Elders. You remember she was on here a couple of nights back? She used to be the Surgeon General. I said, what is the best thing about not being the Surgeon General anymore? And she says, Tom, I never have to wear that stupid uniform again. Barbara Walters is just around the corner. We'll be right back after these messages.
Connie, whom I'm very fond of. That's another myth that women in television don't like.
Of course it is. I wouldn't even bring that stupid stuff up.
Okay. And aren't you glad that we've got a phone call so that people don't know that I was asking you how come you never married and whether you're happy and so on? But I'm not going to
ask that if you want, but I'm not going to tell you no matter how many times you ask it. Why do you love to ask people about this?
Because I care about you and because we haven't seen each other since we used to, you know, take a walk and talk 20 years ago.
I saw you at the Marvin Kittman party in New York.
But we didn't talk. Anyway, to get back to Connie, hello, Connie. So I asked Connie to send me the tape. If you saw the whole tape, and nobody did.
Oh, I did.
Saw that, okay, they saw that little section, and that was it. There was a point, 4 or 5 minutes into it, when Mr. Gingrich, the father, says, well, you know, Newt isn't really from the South. He whispers, you know, he was born in...
Harrisburg Hospital.
Right.
Yeah.
He's really a Yankee. And Connie whispers back, we won't tell anybody. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So that was the tone of this whole... Everybody was whispering, and Connie
We
was
don't have to do it here.
saying,
We can say it right out. We can just blurt it right
But that's the way they were doing it.
Yeah.
You see, and Connie's saying, we won't tell anybody. So that when, 10 minutes later, she said, just between you and me, we won't tell anybody. It was part of the whole interview.
Yeah, it was part of the shtick of the interview.
That's right. If you take it by itself, it sounds like she should have said off the record, this terrible girl. It wasn't. And then the other thing, everybody picks on Connie. Mrs. Gingrich said, Hillary Clinton is a bitch. Look, you know, Mrs. Gingrich is a nice older woman, and it came out as kind of, isn't she spicy? She went on another program the next night. All she had to say was, listen, I'm sorry, I was trapped last night with Connie Chung. I'm not going to repeat this. She said it again. She came on your program. So this is no mistake that she
By the way,
said
when they came here, they said, we don't want to talk about Connie Chung.
But she had done it the next night.
I know.
She'd done on the next
American
night.
Journal or Inside Edition.
And nobody ever apologized to Hillary Clinton, who is with it all, or not with it all, who is our First Lady and deserves a position of respect. I don't think that Connie did anything wrong. I think that CBS, perhaps, didn't realize what was happening.
Well, it wasn't very helpful when the CBS brass came out the next day, and here's our first little test, fellas. When they came...
That's right, we are on that network.
Yeah, we are. And by the way, it ain't on videotape, so they can't take it out. But it didn't help when the CBS brass kind of left Connie out there twisting on the end of a rope.
Connie had got a bum rap, and I really am very glad, Tammy, that you've asked about it. Connie is a good and hard-working reporter.
I handled it myself.
I beg your pardon?
I agree with the way Connie did it myself. I think she did a good job.
And, you know, when all is said and done, so what? I mean, you know, so she said that Newt didn't think very highly of the First Lady. So what? He's a Republican. I mean, did you see, by the way, what Gingrich said about men and women the other day?
Yeah. That sucks.
Yeah.
Did you hear what he said about the press tonight?
No.
He said they were criticizing the book sale, and he said, I'm a revolutionary, and they're reactionaries, the Democrats and the press, and went on to lambast them. Good for him.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you know.
It's a free country. Say what you want, pal.
That's right. But he could also have said to his mother, as I used to say to my mother, don't go on, Mom, because, you know, you've never been on before, and who knows what you'll, you know.
Yeah. You got to be careful with us, Mom. We do strange things. Tammy, I'm very glad you called. Thanks.
Okay, I want to tell George Burns happy birthday.
I'm sure he's watching.
Yeah,
I
happy
saw him
birthday,
last
George.
night.
Good night, Tammy.
Good night.
Bye. You saw George?
I saw him. I've known George Burns all my life, really, in many ways, through my father.
Oh, sure. Lou Walter's Latin Quarter. There you go.
And I was at a restaurant, and someone came over to me and said, George is 99 years old.
Yeah.
Would you go back and say hello to him? So I did. And I put my hand out, and I said, George, do you think I'm too old for you? And he said, I think you're too young for me. And I said, do you think we could make it together? And there was this pause. I could tell that he couldn't hear me too well. And he said, what? And I said, do you think we could make it together? And he said, only if we just agree to use the bottom halves of our bodies. And I thought, he's 99 years old. How wonderful. Happy
He's truly
birthday.
wonderful. You know, the Latin Quarter and being in your dad's family as a kid, when were you aware that showbiz was your dad's life and that he ran this fabulous nightclub that featured the best entertainment of its time?
From the time I was a little girl, because the first Latin Quarter opened in Boston. But, you know, when I look back now, and there are still comedians in the business, Milton Berle or Henny Youngman, who still think of me as Lou Walter's daughter, not Barbara Walters.
Yeah.
But when I was...
Is that okay with you, by the way?
Oh, yeah, I'm so proud of my dad now. But when I was growing up, I wanted my father to be like everybody else's father.
Yeah.
My father was not home. Friday night was a big night. You know, Daddy would stay home. And we went to the Latin Quarter at Christmas and birthdays and Thanksgiving. I didn't want that. I wanted to be home. You know, I wanted to be like everybody else.
Have a turkey, you know, have a roast,
you know,
whatever.
have the family there. And I didn't think it was wonderful. However, you know, I mean, I've talked about this occasionally. I used to sit in the lighting booth and watch the shows when I was a kid in Florida, and the Latin Quarter in Florida was the place.
Yeah,
Ambassador Joe Kennedy used to come there, and Howard Hughes.
Would he come with Gloria Swanson or Rose?
I wouldn't have known,
Oh, yeah,
you know. But I
See,
can
now you would. That's it.
No, I would. But I can do all the numbers. I used to say if I had 2 glasses of wine, I could do Milton Berle, and I could do Willie Howard and Sophie Tucker. I mean, it's the side of me I hide. But anyway.
Come on, give me your Berle.
I don't know. Well, shall I tell you what he used to do? He would come out and he'd stand in front of the microphone and he'd go, "Oh, I was goosed by Westinghouse." Now, I mean, who needs to know that? Why do I have to remember that? I have never, ever said that. You know, there's a wonderful reporter for the New York Times named Judy Miller, and she writes a great deal about the Middle East.
Yeah,
and her father was a man named Bill Miller. He had a place called Bill Miller's Riviera, and he now lives in Las Vegas. And Judy and I have talked about our backgrounds. You know, it's the minister's daughter who's the hellraiser, and it's the man who owns nightclubs who you know, turns out as we did. And my dad was an entrepreneur. My father did the shows. My father had nothing to do with mobs or gambling. He did these beautiful Ziegfeld-like shows.
Yeah.
Strange background.
Goose by Westinghouse. It's funny how
I'll pretend I never said that.
Yeah, I know you will, but I got it on tape, even though we're... It's funny. What does Barbara Walters have in her mind when she's doing television shows? She's thinking about Goose.
I never think about, oh, please. Oh, I'm so sorry I did that. I cannot tell you.
Hey, listen, if I were Letterman, I'd run that tape where you and Ed McMahon sell the tires or whatever it was when you did the commercial. Remember dear Betty Furness in our building? I think of, when you mentioned Westinghouse, I think of her so often. God, she was so great, man.
And this is a woman who really changed her whole life around and went into it.
Let me do a commercial, then we'll go into my personal life. We'll be right back with Barbara Walters, who is Act 4 tonight. We'll continue after these messages. Here is Debbie calling from Waynesville, North Carolina. Hi, Deb. You're on the air.
Hi,
Hi.
Barbara. I wanted to tell you how much I admire you. I think you're wonderful.
Oh, dear.
My husband and I are blind, and I love the way you describe things when you interview people. It really helps us. But the question I wanted to ask you is, which interview stands out the most and that you've had to prepare for and has made you the most nervous?
The interview that would stand out, I mean, when you do so many, they sort of blur, and it's always the next one.
Sure they do.
The one that I think that would stand out most would be an interview, a series of interviews that I did with Anwar Sadat.
It's funny, I was thinking the same thing. I can see on the plane with him flying to Tel Aviv for the first time. What a night, huh?
Yeah. And I mean, he did change the world, and I knew him. Really, I was privileged to know him so well. The very first night that I was on ABC News, I interviewed Anwar Sadat. In those days, you didn't interview anybody in the news. It was a terrible thing to do.
Right.
I got criticized.
What do you mean, put a news interview in the middle of a
That's-
news program?
So that's the
Damn it,
one.
what do you think you're doing here, Walters? Yeah.
That's the one I would remember the most, and probably the most nervous was an interview that we did live for an hour with Richard Nixon after he had done the David Frost one, which he'd sold.
Sure.
And then we did this, and when it was finished, I remember in the middle of it, I had worked so hard because I thought if I ask questions that are too tough, I'm going to look,
Sure,
you
you're
know.
kicking him when he's
and
down.
if I don't ask them tough enough, he's going to filibuster and so on. So I did all the foreign policy questions, and then I thought I would give him a chance to show a warmer side, and I asked him how he got through all of these years. And he said, like you, why are you asking me personal questions? He said, why don't we go back to the foreign policy questions? So I riffled through my notes.
Can I tell you something about guys? We'd rather talk about foreign policy than our love life. Yeah.
Well, anyway,
we only talk about it with other guys, and we use the language you don't want to hear.
Anyway, just to finish this, I couldn't find the questions, so I had to do them. Fortunately, I'd written them, so I knew them. When it was all done, I stood up, and what had happened was that when I had been done with the foreign policy questions, I put them under, and I sat on them. And then what was I going to do? Stop. When we finished, he was perspiring, I was ice cold, and that was the one I was most nervous.
No kidding. Richard Nixon. Debbie, in what way does Barbara describe things? Could you give me an example of how she is descriptive in an interview that helps you to see it even though you don't see?
Well, when she's at these stars' homes,
Right.
she describes the house. She tells how it's decorated.
Nice of you. I would never have thought of that, and we do.
And you know it really helps. It really helps me to know what kind of taste these people have.
Debbie, you know, sometimes when we talk about, is there anything that we do that makes a difference, and I don't want to sound pompous.
Then don't.
But that's nice to hear what
Sure
you're
it
saying,
is.
isn't
Well,
it?
and
Isn't it?
Tom,
Yeah.
my grandmother is a big fan of yours, and she was so happy when you signed up to come to CBS.
That's great.
And I really think it was wonderful what you did last night, matching the Citibank's amount for those
Thanks.
two
It
gentlemen.
was no big deal. You know, we were happy to do it, but that's very nice of you to mention that, Deb.
Barbara, I love you.
Okay.
And good luck.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we love you
Bye-bye.
back. Bye-bye, Deb. Yeah.
Can I tell my story about you that I was going
Sure
to
you
do?
can.
I
But
wonder
before
if
you
you
do it,
remember.
I promise you can do it
Okay.
here. I just want to ask you one more question. You talked about your dad and how
Yeah.
proud you were of him. How's your sister, kid?
My sister died.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear
Yeah.
that. I did not know that.
I know. I didn't talk about it very much, and as you know, I don't talk about it very much.
I know you don't.
But I guess I used to think that if I ever wrote a book, my book would be called Sister, because it probably was the dominant reason for my working, and I guess maybe in a way the
What a lot of
background.
people don't know about you is, yeah, you do this for the glory and the money, but you worked many years because you had to.
I had to,
You had a
yeah.
sister who was not as bright as the rest of us.
Yeah, my sister was mildly retarded,
And
and my
so you-
father lost it all. And I don't want to do that. Let me talk about
I know,
him
but
instead.
a
You
lot
don't
of-
want to.
Go ahead, go ahead. What does she have left? What did I run the clock down to?
About a minute and a half.
Okay.
I can tell this fast. I have a very special feeling about you. I always have, and you know it, and that's why I'm here tonight. And it goes for many things that we did together. But, and I don't know whether you remember this, I got divorced. Do you remember the story? When my daughter was about 8 years old. And it was a no-fault divorce, but you still had to go to court that day. And it was on all of the news programs that night. It was on WNBC, CBS, and WABC, and it was not on NBC. You were doing the local news. You did not put it on. When the evening was over, the head of the news called you up and said, why didn't you put that on? That was news. You're doing People in the News. It doesn't matter that Barbara works here. You're doing People in the News. Her divorce was announced today. Why didn't you put it on? And you said, she has a child. I never forgot it. You are one of the nicest, softest, now say something to counteract that.
Yeah, this big, loudmouth, arrogant, yeah.
yeah,
Now I'm going to tell one on you.
I think our time is up.
This is an ABC, Barbara. I was at a party at the Shankses many, many years ago that you were at with Howard Cosell, God love him, and Rune Arledge was there, and I think a couple other ABC people. And a number of us, not you, because you had no idea that this was going on, but some of us in the room began to smoke cigarettes that were not manufactured by tobacco companies.
I would never have known.
I know you wouldn't have. Now, about a week later, I'm watching you on television, and there's a man there showing how people at home grow marijuana. And he said, now, Barbara, and he put it up on the desk, he says, this is a marijuana plant. And you said to him with a perfectly straight face, oh, is that what marijuana looks like? I've never seen it before.
You could be sitting in front of me, doing it, putting it in your ear, smoking it. I wouldn't know.
Bless
Does
you
that
for...
make me sound awfully square?
Not
well,
at all.
so be it.
Hey, you're the hippest thing in television, kid. Don't let them tell you otherwise. In everything you do, have a great time, and you're always welcome here, and I love you from all my heart, and I'm going to cry and all that stuff, and thanks, pal. Okay, Barbara Walters, folks, from ABC News, 2020, Friday nights, 10 Eastern.
Thank you.
Miranda Richardson. Barbara Walters, Miranda Richardson. Now, these messages, get off me.
See yourself now, baby. Not my fault. Used to be.
You know, you sit and talk to her, and your whole life starts flashing before your eyes. It brings me to become greatly emotional. And then she went out and fired up a big joint. You want to believe? No. It's been a long week, I'll tell you. It's been a long life. And please...